Hey folks, welcome back. It is a cold, wet April day, and despite the fact that it's so cold outside, there is still plenty happening on the homestead. So I thought today I'd share with you my own method for producing my own syrup and sugar right from my own backyard and show you how you can do so as well, because contrary to popular belief, it is actually very simple to get started and you may already have everything that you need to do so. So I've been making syrup from my backyard trees this is our third year, and this has been our most successful year. I've had enough experience that I feel comfortable sharing what's worked well for me and some of the experimentation that I've done. I do want to say I am not an expert at this by any means. This is not going to be a highly scientific presentation of how to make perfect, consistent maple syrup. This is just going to cover the basics to give you an idea of what the process looks like. And if you're like me and you're not afraid of a little experimentation, this is a great project that's fun to do with kids. It's fun to do by yourself. It's really a fun activity for passing the time in early March to mid-April when you can't quite be outside in the garden yet, but you still want to be doing something productive. We've managed in just the last few weeks to make a year's worth supply, at least for what we use in my family, of maple syrup, and now we're experimenting with making maple sugar from that excess as well. So if you're anything like me, I was hesitant to get started with syruping because I assumed there was going to be a much larger upfront cost. When I was a student at the University of Maine, I remember walking through some of the trails where they would have their sap collection system set up, which was like a series of long tubes with vacuum systems and collection buckets, and they had a whole sugar shack just dedicated for evaporating the sap. And so I kind of had an idea that this was probably going to be a bit over my head and not something that I could easily do at home. I'm glad to say that I was completely wrong about that. It is actually quite straightforward, and you probably have all of the tools you need, with some small exceptions, to get started at home. But there really isn't that much of an upfront cost, and I'll share with you how we do it. So the most important thing that you need for making syrup is going to be a stand of healthy hardwood trees. Now, it is going to be specific species of hardwood trees, but contrary to popular belief, it's not just sugar maples that you can make syrup from. You can actually make syrup from almost any species of maple. There are some exceptions. You can make syrup from sugar maples, red maples, Norway maples. You can make sugar even from birch trees, sycamore trees, box elders, and even walnuts. So if you have any of those species in your backyard and they are the correct age and they're healthy trees, there's potential there that you could start collecting sap to make your own syrup. You can purchase a sap tapping kit for about $80 at most hardware stores when the season is right, usually starting in late February up until early April, though many people find creative solutions to make their own kits from scratch with things as simple as a plastic bag on a hook. So don't rule it out if you can't scrounge up the dollars. There are plenty of ways to collect sap if you're motivated enough. If you do live in warmer climates where you don't get springtime temperatures that are below freezing, it's unlikely you're going to be able to make syrup from your trees. Sap collecting requires a certain set of conditions. So when the tree is going into its dormant period during the winter, what happens is all of that energy, all of that sap flows back down to the root system and kind of sits there for the dormant period. And once temperatures start to warm up, that sap that has all of the sugar and nutrients needed for the tree to grow and produce leaves, that starts flowing back up the tree. And when that starts to happen, that's when you get the sap flow that ends up coming out of your taps. So in order for that flow to happen, there needs to be warm, sunny days that are above freezing temperatures. That's kind of what tells the tree, okay, it's time to start collecting that energy from the root system and sending it back up to the foliar parts of the tree. Now, what happens in spring is you'll often have those warm sunny days that are above freezing temperatures, and then at night it cools back down and goes below freezing. So when that happens, now you have the branches where the sap has gone, that's going to flow back down the tree, back down the trunk into the root system, and you'll also get sap flow during that period of time. Now, if you don't have these very specific conditions, if you have a period period of warm weather where it's above freezing at night or it stays cold and cloudy during the day, you're just not going to have that sap flow, and that's why it's very difficult to replicate this process in warmer climates. So this sap that you end up collecting is what contains the sugar that gets reduced down as you evaporate the excess water to make your syrup. Now, depending on the species of tree, the sugar content is going to vary. Sugar maples, you can probably guess by the name, it's going to have the highest ratio of sugar content to water, and then it's going to vary for your other species, and it can be dependent on other things too, like the health of the tree, the location of the tree. You're going to need to collect more sap to make the same amount of syrup as if you were collecting it from a sugar maple. Another thing you want to consider once you've figured out whether you have the appropriate species for making syrup on your property is the age and the health of the tree. So the Cooperative Extension at the University of Maine, they're going to recommend that you only tap trees that have a 10-inch DBH. DBH is an acronym for diameter at breast height, which is about 4.5 feet. And I want to say a 10-inch diameter tree is going to be kind of like this. That's a rough estimate. Now, I'll admit on my own property, we don't actually have any mature sugar maples. And I'll also admit some of the maples that we tap are a little bit smaller than that 10-inch DBH. So the Cooperative Extension recommends 10 inches just so you're not affecting the health of the tree by tapping it. We've been tapping our smaller trees for 3 years now. We haven't run into any issues, so that's at your discretion, just something to keep in mind. But anyway, it's about 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. And that is if you're looking at specifically sugar maples. So again, that ratio is going to be even higher for your birches, your red maples, your sycamores, your walnut, etc. All right, so let's talk about setup. So I'm in my living room right now, and you'll notice behind me my cat grooming herself, but also there is a wood stove with a catering pan on it. So this is how we evaporate our sap to make maple syrup. And I'm going to show you kind of my setup and how we do things here. This isn't going to work for everybody, and I'll explain why, but I'm hoping this will give you ideas, especially if you're somebody like me who uses wood stove heating. If you don't have wood stove heating, you can also create or replicate this setup outside in like a fire pit. So once your buckets are full and you've collected your sap, you're ready to start evaporating it. Like I mentioned before, some folks use sugar shacks that are dedicated just to evaporating the syrup, especially for larger setups. I'm able to get away with making it right inside my own living room using our wood stove. So one of the most common concerns and mistakes that people make when they're making maple syrup or any type of hardwood syrup is they will evaporate it in their house, and they don't realize that high humidity, it really builds up inside the house. So I've heard horror stories where folks had the wallpaper peeling off of their walls, their ceilings bubbling where the steam rose up to the ceiling. So that's just something to keep in mind. You need to have a space that's well ventilated or a space that's not going to be adversely affected by high humidity. Now in my home, since our heating is primarily like 90% wood heat, it gets really, really dry in here. During the winter, it's as low as like 10% humidity. Honestly, it can be awful on the sinuses and the lungs. And so I actually really enjoy this time of year when we're making our maple syrup, because it brings that humidity up just enough that it's comfortable in the house. And honestly, my plants love it too. It's funny, like this time of year, I have a lemon tree that always struggles because of how bone dry it gets inside my house. And whenever we start our syruping season, it starts to grow again. So it's actually putting on new growth right now. I'll probably show you that in a little bit. So I bring the sap into our house, and I just set it on top of our wood stove in these catering pans. So my husband purchased these at a restaurant consignment store. Now you don't have to use catering pans. It's just really useful because this will hold about 2 gallons, which is a bucket's worth of syrup if you use those kits that I showed you earlier. Almost exactly 2 gallons. It goes straight up to the top. And what's nice about these is they have a high surface area, which means it's going to evaporate faster than if you put it into a pot. However, if all you have are your kitchen pots and pans, you can use those as well. It's just going to take a little bit longer. So we set these on top of our wood stove. fill it up with the sap, and I basically just let it go all day. I find it's helpful to start this process late at night, so that way I can load up the wood stove, keep the house warm, go to bed, and I don't have to usually worry about it getting so low that it's starting to burn at the bottom of the pan. Usually by the time I wake up, it's reduced by like more than half, but it's still not quite syrup anyway. So once you've reduced the sap down to at least 1/4 of its original volume, you can keep going in your larger pans, or you can transfer it to a stovetop to finish. How long this takes depends on how much you've reduced the sap already. I've had it take anywhere from 4 hours to 30 minutes. But before I transfer to the stove, I like to do at least 1 round of filtering. We'll talk more about what to use for filtering in just a moment, but in short, I run all of my syrup through at least 1 filter to remove debris that may have fallen into the collection buckets. I find that a colander over a large pot works fine, and I can walk away and let it filter, as this process can be a bit slow. So how do you know when you've reduced it enough to make syrup or sugar? Most experts use hydrometers to determine consistency. I usually just take a spoonful and let it cool and taste test it until it's syrupy enough for my liking, though that does mean that every batch is a little different. You want to get your syrup to at least 209 to 213 degrees to make syrup. So if you have a candy thermometer, that helps too. So while we are making sugar in this video, I do want to talk a little bit about the syrup making process if that's what you decide to do instead. So filtering is the final step before bottling, and if you're making syrup, this can be one of the most frustrating parts, both for me and for others in the hobby syrup making community. So natural syrup produces a byproduct called niter, also known as sugar sand, and it's completely harmless. It's just the natural minerals present in the tree sap, mostly calcium and magnesium. But many folks like to remove this from their syrup so that it has more of that pure, glassy commercial look. So cheesecloths or even nut milk bags won't filter niter effectively. You'll need to use wool filters or filter cones designed for syrup making to remove this, and it may take more than 1 pass through to remove. However, if you're just working with the most basic of setups and you don't have any method of filtering, you can actually skip right over this process and just make maple sugar. Maple sugar starts when you boil the syrup until it reaches 257 to 262 degrees Fahrenheit. I discovered this when I was attempting to make maple butter. I let it go too long and it started to harden after I poured, so I quickly took an electric mixer to break it apart, and that's how I accidentally ended up with maple sugar. So once you get it up to temperature, it will start to foam heavily. There's a few ways to avoid it spilling over. You can put a little butter on the rim of your pan and that will stop it from boiling over, or you can just set it on low heat and continue until it seems like the entire pot is nothing but foam with no layer of syrup at the bottom. At this point, it's time to start letting it cool and stirring with an electric mixer. It's going to take about 15 minutes of stirring as it cools for it to turn into sugar, so be patient, and if after 15 minutes it's still not starting to pebble, place it back on the heat for a few minutes and repeat this process. Alright, so we have our final product here, and before I put this into our mason jar, I just wanted to talk about how much it took me to make about 4 cups of maple sugar. So we started off with approximately 9.5 gallons of sap, and that was reduced into 3 cups of maple syrup. And after it was processed, it made about 4 cups of maple sugar. So every year I like to gift some of my syrup to family and friends, and now that I've managed to make a little bit of maple sugar, I'm also giving these little sample size jars of maple sugar. These are just upcycled or recycled spice jars that I keep from what we use throughout the year. And then the rest of this is just for our household use. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit that like button down below and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.